Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us. I am Joseph Holmes. I am a culture writer for Religion Unplugged and podcast host for The Overthinkers. With us today is Naomi Riley. She is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and concurrently a senior fellow at the Independent Women's Forum. She is an author of multiple books, including No Way to Treat a Child, Be the Parent, and, of course, for our purposes today, she is the author of Til Faith Do Us, How Interfaith Marriage is Transforming America. Thank you so much for coming on today, ma'am.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So I was going through the internet the other day, and one of the things that's been coming up a lot in discussions recently is the rise of interfaith relationships. That is, people who are willing to date and be in relationships with and married to people outside their own faith background. According to Pew Research, only 19% of Americans who wed before 1960 were in an interreligious marriage. But in 2010, 39% were. Yet, what's interesting, of course, concurrently to that is what's become increasingly common. So while that's become more common, it's also become more common for people to say that they are their deal breaker is somebody who votes differently, who's outside of their political party. I think it's like something like 71% of Democrats say they won't date somebody who votes for the other party, and it's like 39% of Republicans or something like that. So you've written a book on interfaith relationships. I was wondering what in your research, what did you find as sort of the reason that people were more open, are increasingly open to dating outside their religion?
Sure. Well, there are a lot of reasons people are increasingly open to dating outside their religion. One, of course, is that religion has become less important to a lot of people. We have become a less religious nation. And so even people who nominally say, they subscribe to a particular religion, it might not be important to them. But one other important factor, I think, and one that was really highlighted in the survey and the interviews that I did for the book, is that the more people wait to get married, the longer they wait to get married, the older they are when they get married, the more likely they are to marry outside their faith. And I think that what's happening is you have this sort of crucial time period when people are in their, early mid-20s, when they are not practicing religion, say, the way they did growing up, or even perhaps the way they intend to later in life. They're, changing jobs and roommates and cities and all sorts of things, and they haven't really put down religious roots. And so when you meet someone at that stage of life, when you're sort of engaged in those kind of more secular practices, maybe you're not going to church or synagogue as faithfully as you might have before, maybe you're not as rooted to a community, you meet someone and you sort of give off the impression of someone for whom religion is not particularly important. And then you sort of, kind of get into this relationship where religion is not a big factor. And as I write about in the book, that can sometimes come back to bite you later on. But as you're sort of in those early 20s, there are lots of things that you may have done when you were a kid, when you were living with your parents, or that you intend to do someday with your kids that you're not engaged in now. And of course, lots of religious institutions are tearing their hair out about how to engage those 20-somethings. And it's this, vicious cycle where you're like, well, we do a better job of engaging married people. But on the other hand, if we don't engage the single people, then they're going to get married outside the faith, and it will be less easy for us to engage them anyway. So that's sort of the reason people are, I think, one of the many reasons people are marrying outside the faith more often is that they're waiting longer to get married, and they're getting married at a secular time in their lives. In terms of politics, obviously you have these sort of independent political factors, which is that our country's just become much more politically polarized. But I also think, there used to be this mantra that you weren't supposed to talk about, politics or religion at the dinner table. I think people have continued to believe that you're not supposed to talk about religion very publicly. But politics is kind of anything goes these days. And so it's not surprising that you find people who go out on a first or second date and, by the end of that date, where they are on abortion, on gun control, on Donald Trump, on all sorts of things. And they, it's one of the first things that comes tumbling out of sometimes young people's mouths, for better or worse. And I think that their religious beliefs, on the other hand, and their faith practices tend to be much more private. And so the relationships where you have people sort of saying their political views up front, and those things are kind of deal breakers, you find out right away before you've gotten to know anything else about the person, where you might be willing to make some compromises. And I think with religion, I found in my survey that, I think more than half of couples didn't actually talk about how they what religion they wanted to raise their children in before they got married. And so that's an issue where people just, oh, we'll just deal with it later, and it's very private, and I'm not going to discuss it. But, you want to know my opinion on, Donald Trump, you're going to find out within the first 5 minutes of our first date.
Yeah. Okay, so you brought up a lot of really interesting things here that I want to unpack a little bit, but then not go on to something that you alluded to, which is that it comes back to bite them oftentimes later. So you brought up the aspect that that religion is just not as important as a country as it once was, but politics has become increasingly important. I think that's really interesting. It makes a lot of sense because, there's a lot of, and you also discussed how, we don't talk about religion or religion at the dinner table, but we do talk about politics. I think there's been an interesting shift. You have the phrase, the personal is political. That's often, but you also people talk about the secular sacred divide, how, during the Enlightenment, it was like, okay, religion is a private matter that you keep to yourself, and that's a personal thing. Whereas the politics was growing, well, no, everything is a part of politics. And it does make sense, the great de-churching that was talking about, well, why are people stopping going to church? One of the aspects of the data that they brought up is that essentially, one day a week for people, religion is relevant to them. Like Christian, for Christianity, like you're going to church on Sunday, and for Jewish, you go to, you go to temple on Saturday, but other aspects of your life, your work, your family, your politics, is with you 6 days a week. And so those kind of things sort of take priority. And so you mentioned that aspect of it's just not as important anymore. It does seem that, most people see more aspects of their daily life that are going to be touched by politics. Again, if you're going to work and you're getting, DEI training, or you've got some people, or somebody might be harassing you at work, you've got those questions coming up. It's like, oh, is my, you can think, oh, is my husband actually going to be expecting me to bear the burden of raising children? It's like, if he's not a feminist, it's kind of like, okay, that feels more relevant. Whereas to what our relationships be like. Whereas so much of our religious life is sort of segregated to these small places. We think, oh, this is not going to be as big a deal. And you brought that up also very, very interestingly, because the other thing you brought up that's fascinating to me is that, in particular times of our life is more secular. So when we're just leaving home and we haven't gotten married yet, and we're working, so much of our life is in we've got to, pay our bills. We've got all these other things that are just more secular in our lives. I think the origin of dating created this book talking about how we enter in the dating world. We enter into sort of a world of strangers for the first time. And at times past, it was okay. It was in a small town. We would mostly be dating people in. So we'd mostly be dating people we kind of knew or had family or some relations with. And now, if we're in the cities, it's mostly strangers who mostly know our work identities and things like that. So it's all very interesting. I think that's fascinating. I think it makes a lot of sense as to why those trends are going in the direction they are. But you brought up something.
I will just say, in terms of like sort of the political sort of being relevant to all these aspects of your life. I mean, I'm not sure that that's necessarily what's driving it so much as just sort of being in a culture where politics has unfortunately become paramount, and just being surrounded by social media and other stories that everybody feels the need to wear their politics on their sleeve. Like all of, these important public policy issues always touch people's lives. Yep. But the reason that our country is so polarized now, and the reason why everybody seems to be living politics 24/7, I think has much more to do with like the media environment and the culture than the actual relevance of who is in the White House to your daily life. So anyway, that's a side note, but.
No, that's absolutely true. And I think I should clarify, it's when I sort of say it's like it takes up our lives 6 days a week, partly what I mean is that, if you're going to get a church message, on Sunday, but then the rest of the week you're going to be watching the news, and the news is going to talk about politics. So it feels more relevant to you because that's the rest of the week. That's the kind of messages you're getting. So that's an excellent point, that it's not that politics has become actually more relevant to our lives.
Right.
It's that it seems to be more relevant to our lives and our identities now than it used to be. That's an excellent point.
Anyway, but I sidetracked you. Sorry.
No. That's excellent clarification. Now, by what I want to ask you about then is that you brought up the fact that some of these come back to bite them, because again, it's a particular time of their lives that their lives are the most secular, kind of in their 20s when they're first starting out. So what is it that people aren't getting or not realizing is be relevant to them? What ways does it come back to bite them oftentimes when they do enter into an interreligious relationship?
Right. So, I mean, one of the things that my survey looked at was levels of marital satisfaction. And not surprisingly, given that, we largely have a lot of choice about whether to get married and who to get married to, Americans generally have a pretty high level of marital satisfaction. But there was a variation, a gap between same-faith couples and interfaith couples. Interfaith couples had a slightly lower level of marital satisfaction. And I thought, I think this is interesting, and some surveys have shown a slightly higher level of divorce among interfaith couples. I think this is interesting, for a variety of reasons. If you talk to marriage counselors or psychologists, or really anybody who's familiar with, or even in a marriage, they might tell you that the three things that married couples are most likely to fight over are how you spend your time, how you spend your money, and how you raise your children. And religion, in some form or another, can impact all of those. Whether you are tithing, whether you are sending your kids to Jewish summer camp, whether you are going to services on a regular basis, whether you are celebrating the holidays and how you are celebrating the holidays. And I think there's a lot of sort of, we'll just figure that out when it comes along. And, the other thing that I think people, tend to misunderstand is that, some couples obviously do make these decisions, before the kids come. So, we are going to raise our kids Jewish. We are going to raise our kids Catholic, Mormon, Muslim, whatever. And then they sort of assume that that's like a one-time decision. And it is not a one-time decision. It is an everyday decision in some cases. Because what that means is obviously can mean very different things in different communities, in different contexts. Maybe your spouse who's of another faith feels comfortable going to a particular religious institution, but then let's say the leader of that institution retires and somebody else takes over, and that person doesn't make your spouse feel as comfortable. Is your spouse going to continue coming? What does that message send to your children if their spouse stops coming? You decided you were going to send your kids to a particular kind of, Catholic school. Is that for all your kids? When you have to make a decision about high school, when you have to make a decision about whether that's still appropriate given other factors. I think these are such complicated questions and really could be, explored on a, monthly, if not daily basis among some couples, and even couples who don't, for whom religion is not a primary factor or who don't think of it that way. So I think those are the two sort of ways that people, misunderstand what's happening. First, that it's a decision we can put off till later. And second, once you've made the decision, that it's like a one-time thing and now we're done, we've made the decision, moving on to the next thing.
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple of things that are really fascinating here that I would like to kind of get you to touch on a bit. Is what is that, like, optimistically, the levels of satisfaction are slightly lower, and and it's slightly higher risk of divorce. And so, the difference is, it's not like it's not there, but it does seem like it's, not super, it's not like a death, curse if you do end up dating somebody or marrying somebody, particularly who is of a different religious background. And I would assume that part of that is self-selection process. Again, if you are choosing to marry somebody who's of a different faith, then you probably also, those religious differences are not as big a factor in your core values.
Right. Although I would say by contrast, like, on a day-to-day basis, how you feel about gun control is going to have significantly less impact about on your marriage. I mean,
Well, so
obviously you can envision certain circumstances, but I really fundamentally don't think that that's something that's going to come up on a regular basis as you're raising your kids or as you're, deciding, what to do on your Saturdays or Sundays. I mean, and so it's just interesting that people, have this block about those kinds of political issues or frankly, who's in the White House. Whereas, things like religion just seem like these sort of vague things that, we don't really need to deal with.
Well, that's I think an excellent point, and I was going to bring that up sort of later, as we could sort of talk about this now. Then, because you very wisely pointed to that, is so again for me, I'm a Christian, and so for me see like Christianity is the core value that politics is built on top of, and so it's like if again if for me it's like if if we say, okay, Jesus says it, like that's the trump card of our decision makings that we make. And so it's hard for me to imagine, being married to somebody who didn't have that same, primary value of, Jesus is Lord, if as long as we both agree on how to interpret what he said, then if he says it, that's the way we go. It is weird to me that we've supplanted, because religion makes the claim that it is an actual getting to the bottom of what the universe actually is. And that's the claim it's making. And so it's weird to me that you would, politics is really about application. So it's like, okay, how do we apply these whatever core values that we have? That's how I see it. So it does seem weird and backwards to me that we would say, oh, it's not a big deal, what our core values that we believe at the bottom, what reality is actually like. That would not, that would be a smaller deal that our agreements or disagreements of how to apply what those values are in practice. Now, I understand the aspect of like, oh, if you're voting to have the guns pointed in my direction, that's a very practically relevant to me. And I understand that. But like you said, there are very few actual political things that are actually, guns pointed in my direction, metaphorically.
Right. But I mean, this is what, when people talk about how politics has become a religion, this is what they mean, which is that, this is the at core, at bottom, what you think. And there is nothing,
beneath
separating that, core from the application of it. It's all just one, this is my identity. Any criticism of these public policy issues is a fundamental attack on me personally.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I think that's the best description of that, is that politics has become a religion. And by that, it means it's describing reality all the way down, in which it didn't before. But to your point, I forget the actual article that I'm getting this from, but somebody was pointing to studies that also showed, I just said, the levels of satisfaction and divorce are not super different between interreligious couples and interfaith couples and non-interfaith couples, but neither are the levels of marital satisfaction for people who are married cross-politically as well. So your point that people, regardless of whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, that people are, more open to dating people outside their faith and less, open to dating politically, the ratios are way off. People are are taking the political thing way too seriously, and they're not taking the religious thing seriously enough. They need to have a much better equilibrium than they're having right now. Would you say that's an accurate way to describe it?
I mean, yes, I think that's probably a reasonable position to take. But some people would say like this truly is my core, and
sure,
and I wouldn't want to advise someone to marry them, assuming that they would get over it. So yeah, I take your
yes, no, we should. The discussion should be, maybe you should reevaluate your core, perhaps.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
But I think also, okay, so the other thing that I think is interesting about what you said is that people are coming in again to marriages, relationships at a secular point in their lives, and then that they're coming up against things that don't realize are going to be problems because they're in a different place in their lives. Right. And so, but then also you're saying it has to be it's decisions you have to make day by day, because again, it's such a core thing and becomes even more of a core thing that it kind of keeps being the same, even though things in your life change. Like I say, like you're comfortable with
Right.
this
I mean, there are
past,
going to
you're
be
good
these
with
big symbolic moments where, like, you're
right.
in this interfaith relationship and you're like, oh my gosh, who's going to marry us? Where are we going to get married? Like,
Yeah.
what is going to be said during the ceremony? Like, these are sort of big things. Or, are we going to have a baptism? Are we going to have a bris? Or, those are, is there a kid going to be bar mitzvahed? Where? Like, those are, I think, the things that people think will happen down the line. And those are definitely going to happen. But all these other little decisions that have to do with sort of the level of comfort of the people in the marriage and the children, I think, are what people tend to underestimate.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, in the in looking at your book and what you wrote, I found that you are yourself in interreligious marriage, and so I guess for people who were who are potentially entering into something like this, and for the research that you've done for this, like what are the ways that people are best able to navigate these, and what of the challenges that you were able to navigate, how were you able to navigate these successfully?
So I'm in a faith no faith marriage, which in my
Gotcha.
survey
Yes.
counted as an interfaith marriage. But my
Okay, fair
husband
enough.
was not practicing anything when we got married, and even when we started dating. But so I'm Jewish, and he is a former Jehovah's Witness. I had.
Gotcha.
I would say that the sort of the way I navigated this, and I think, I don't mind saying this is, I think, an important bit of advice for other people, is that I actually told him on our first date that we were going to raise our children Jewish, which I acknowledge is weird and awkward. And a lot of people would be like, you're crazy. Especially because there's so, that's the other thing that I should mention too, is that the cultural kind of disapproval of talking about where a relationship is going early on in a
Hmm.
relationship is so strong
Yeah.
that I think that makes it harder to have these important
Yeah.
conversations. You're just going to be seen as some like crazy girl who's on her first date talking about kids. And what are, only like, Orthodox Jews and, traditional Catholics are doing that. So, I think that, that works against kind of having these conversations. And I have had a number of friends, who have gotten very far into the interfaith relationships, and they, get more and more attached to the person. And all of a sudden it sort of feels like, okay, well, there is this deal breaker, but we're 2 years in, and that's
Hmm.
really hard. That's a hard
Yeah.
time to have that conversation.
Yeah.
So I guess I would say, having these conversations earlier, even though it's awkward, I think is important. And maybe the first date is not the time, but, it definitely seems like, trying to sort of move away from that idea that,
Before the 6 month mark might be a
yeah,
good.
I mean, you pick where you think is appropriate. But I mean, I think, people are just very, very reluctant to have those serious conversations about, and also may not, like, as I said, because we were talking about kind of being at a secular point in your life, may not have fully taken stock of themselves, of what is the most important thing to them, or what will be important to them later on. So, just sort of having a little bit of a, personal temperature taking before you, sort of get more and more attached to someone, I guess.
Yeah, no. So that's two big things I think are excellent, and we, my co-host and I talked about this on our Overthinkers podcast too, which you should definitely check out. But is that shameless plug? But the thing is that first you do have to first know yourself. Like, what are your actual core values? Like, maybe I might think that your core values might be misaligned, but you should know what your core values are and actually take stock of those and where you actually reasonably think that they're going to be 5 years from now. Recognize that if you're in a particular secular time in your life right now as a young person, statistically it's likely you won't always be that way, and so at least have the self-awareness of that. So self-awareness, but then also communication. And this is, again, every time I read divorce attorneys and psychologists talk about, like, about what happens as relationships, communication, lack of communication is at the top of the list. So in many ways, the interfaith conversation is just like a lot of these other conversations about, hey, you need to be openly and bluntly communicating about your expectations with finances. You need to
Right.
be bluntly
And
communicating
the other
about
thing that
sex and
happens.
things like that. But yeah, go ahead.
Right. No. I mean, I had a number of religious leaders say to me, like, you have to know your non-negotiables. And I
Yeah.
think that's a good way to understand it. But, and the religious leaders sort of are in this, kind of difficult position here because I think, for a lot of time, some of these issues would have come out in marital counseling or like in a premarital counseling setting. But now that's all for most people, just kind of this formality where you meet with the priest or the rabbi or whoever it is, like a couple of times once you've already decided where this relationship is going and you're, 3, 4,
Yeah.
5 years into it. And so, they're then in this sort of awkward position where they're kind of asking you these questions and, you're trying to sort of paper this over because you have a hall reserved and a caterer and everything else. And I think that, that also makes it more difficult. I do, it even something like, the pre-cana, I think is a very useful exercise, even, having a form of that for people, whether or not they're Catholic, just because there's so many questions on that. I mean, even if you don't, I'm not saying everyone's going to agree, or see eye to eye on every one of those questions, but they do. And if you talk to couples who've been through it, raise a lot of interesting questions, which are going to require that kind of communication in the long term. So, any kind of thing you can do. I mean, I don't mean like, take the, Cosmo, are we compatible quiz, but kind of like, some kind of extensive, let's talk about the major issues, that might come up and see where we are before we get very far down this road.
No, that makes total sense. And again, it's one of those things that, and for me, the takeaway is that it's one of those things that people don't think is actually going to be a big deal, but it is going to be a big deal. And you may not, see eye to eye on everything, but it's good to know what things you're not going to see eye to eye on and be able to plan for that and know what those deal breakers are. So is there anything that we haven't covered on this topic that you think is important for us to cover on it before we wrap up?
I think when I talk in the book about, interfaith marriage, I mean, we've talked sort of mostly about the problems of it. And I think that on a personal level and on a familial level, it can be very difficult. But I also, have to say, like, it is kind of a sign of American tolerance and assimilation that we do have such a high rate of interfaith marriage. And the other studies have shown that, if you have someone in your extended family who is someone of another faith, you tend to feel more warmly toward all the members of that other faith. And so I think, at a time where, people are feeling pretty, not getting along so great with a lot of other Americans, it is, a kind of a nice feeling to know that there are still these trends, which are very uniquely American, by the way. I mean, it is interfaith marriage. If you talk to, people in other countries and other continents about interfaith marriage, even just the idea of it is just, seems insane to them. Like, why would you marry outside your own group? And what are you trying to accomplish? And so I think that it's important to, to understand that there is a positive side to this. And that, the other thing, which is kind of interesting, is that, some percentage of these interfaith marriages end in same-faith marriages. And I did a lot of,
I know that may not have, the numbers off the top of your head, but do you know like how large that number is?
It's pretty small. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, and my survey, it's hard to sort of say statistically what was statistically significant. But it was kind of interesting. I mean, for some people, well, they started off as an interfaith couple when they were dating, and just one decided to convert when they got married. But for some, it was a long thing. I talked to people who decided to convert after 20 years or something.
Wow.
They felt so welcome in the community, or they decided to convert when there was a bar mitzvah or something like that. And even when they don't, I mean, there's a lot of support among the member of the other faith. Even if you decide to raise your kids in one faith, there are some very supportive partners out there who truly do, become, a part of the community in every way except, conversion.
Sure.
And so.
Right.
Anyway, I wouldn't want to leave people with the idea that it's all terrible and
No,
marriages can end.
that's an excellent point. Again, if and I can get into this too. I can fall into this trap too, where we're seeing a lot of these trends, and we see the costs that go along with them and the problems that go along with them. Even kind of like even the just sort of the massive kind of amount of choice that creates a sort of difficulty in the dating world. But you make an excellent point that one of the reasons that there is, and people may be shocked even to hear this, that there is such a high rate of marital satisfaction, in America. But one of the reasons that there is because there is so much freedom to choose your actual partner based on
and one of the reasons, by the way, that there used to be less marital satisfaction among interfaith couples than there is now is because of external factors. So, it's similarly to interracial marriage. Like,
right.
Many interracial couples were happy, but it became almost impossible for them to find a place to live and work and be a family because, this group didn't want them and that group didn't want them, and they always felt, ostracized. And I think, if you look back to like the 1950s, being in an interreligious couple, in many cases had that feeling of like, well, we don't belong here, we don't belong there. That leads to a lower level of satisfaction. So as I think external pressures have gone away, that's also increased people's level of satisfaction too.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. If people are interested in your work and the work that you do, where can they find you and support your work?
Sure. So I have a website, Naomi Riley, RILEY.com. And they can also find my work at the website of the American Enterprise Institute, which is AEI.org.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. This is Religion Unplugged with all of your relevant religious news and culture.